Well, it's always a pleasure to come and speak to people at the variety focus programs, because especially when we start getting into varieties like Iberian varieties, I know we're talking to the real varietal nerds out there, because the mainstream people aren't quite as interested in what I think are really some of the most unusual and potentially excellent varieties for California. I also want to publicly thank George and Jesus, who have hosted me before in their native countries, and especially Jesus was wonderful driving me around at a very fast speed between places in Spain and Portugal, and we got to see a lot of the countryside that I know a tourist would never see. So thank you guys. I want to start by talking a little bit about the international varieties. They've really become kind of a model for winemaking in California, for good or for bad. And we already heard a little bit about this: Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. And this is the terminology that is used in Europe. They always talk about the international varieties, and they talk about autochthonous varieties, which is a term a lot of us haven't heard before. But autochthonous means that it's native. And the international varieties dominate the marketplace, and there are several reasons why. First of all, they have a long modern history of export production that goes all the way back to the 1200s. In the 1200s, the British, or the English I should say, were importing wine from Burgundy. And the British in general have always been tremendous consumers of wine. And if you think about living in England, especially 50, 60 years ago, this horrible climate, this terrible food, there's got to be something to make your day good, and a good glass of wine at the end of the day was something that you'd enjoyed. There's always been perception of quality, because very early on, both in Burgundy and Bordeaux, they classified the vineyards and the growths, and they set up standards, and they thought about export, because pretty soon people were investing in vineyards and chateaus, and they couldn't possibly drink all the wine themselves, so they set up a way of exporting it. And also wonderful tradition. I mean, they figured out how to set quality standards, and they followed them pretty closely. And while there's been some fraud, it hasn't been quite as rife as it has in other countries, such as Italy, where they do things like color wine with phenolphthalein, which has a real negative effect on the consumer. And, this is an example of how the French managed to set the model that was really good. Phenolphthalein is the active ingredient in laxatives, just in case you're wondering. So let's think a little bit about European viticulture. My opinion of the French is that the French are the best winemakers in the world, and because they don't always get the best fruit to make wine out of, but they can usually make something drinkable. And I remember my first visit to Champagne in 1998, and the grapes are coming in, and I'm first of all looking at the winemaker dressed in a suit, and I'm amazed, how does a winemaker show up for work in a suit? And he says, the technicians do the work, I just direct the winemaking. And then I'm looking at this fruit, and it's like 10% covered with botrytis and stuff, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what are they going to do with this? And I say, well, what do you think? And he goes, this looks pretty good. He said, we'll sort it out, we'll be fine, don't worry. And that's French winemaking, is that you don't get ideal weather all the time because you're pretty far north. And a lot of your picking decisions are made because of the 21st of September, like clockwork, here comes the rain and you better get moving. And, some years you have vintage years where the fruit actually gets ripe. And the rest of the time you do what you can through blending and fixing. And that's why I think French winemakers are some of the best winemakers in the world. If you actually bring them over to a place where the fruit ripens, like California, they can make some really, really good wine. So most of the grapes are in the 38th to 50th parallel. As you saw, George, I think, had a slide. And Ukiah is on the 38th parallel. So that's kind of the northern end of wine growing here in most of California. That's, the Oregon happens, but that's kind of like a different model for wine growing compared to us. And we'll hear more from the Oregonians about that later in the program. But for the most part, we truly are Mediterranean, and if we follow the 38th parallel around, we're going to discover that it goes through places like Sicily and Athens, Greece, so we're quite a bit further south. All right, so most of our wine growing is from 33 to 38 degrees versus 41 to 50 degrees, which is where most of the French industry is. Our climate is characterized by warm, dry summers and cool but not freezing winters. We have classic Mediterranean weather. We're only 1% of the Earth's surface and about 1 of 6 areas on the planet that truly has a Mediterranean climate. So we're very, very lucky. We've got a great place for growing grapes. Now, let's jump back to 1960 and take a look at what was in our vineyards. If you went to Napa, the main variety was Petit Syrah from southern France. Sonoma's main variety was Zinfandel from southern Italy and Croatia, and Mendocino's main variety was Carrion, or Spain. Now, in the local dialect of Mendocino, these are known as Pets, Zin, and Carriganan. So we have our own way of talking about these old varieties. And that was the basis of the wine industry, and these things were routinely blended together. Just in case you don't know, because a lot of people don't really know where Mendocino and Lake Counties are. Here we are. That's San Francisco, Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and Lake. And this is considered to be sort of the crown jewel of California wine growing. At least we think that. And if we take a look at this region on a topographical map, what you're going to see is that it's very, very mountainous. This is a place where the continental overthrust occurs, where the North American plate and the Pacific plate come together. One went down and one went up, and all of these hilly mountains resulted. There's Santa Rosa with the Santa Rosa Plain, and there's Napa Valley. Anderson Valley is here. This is the Mayakama Mountains that run up into the Yola Valley Wilderness here. Ukiah and Hopland are in the Russian River Valley. And then across the hill is Clear Lake with Big Valley, which is kind of a lacustrine deposits, and then Red Hills is volcanic. So we have this crazy mix of geology and microclimates. Our climate's really regulated by the ocean. As we go from west to east, it gets warmer. And the amount of maritime air that you have affects the kind of climate that you're going to get. So why would you think about planting something different? And these are the kind of the reasons why, is that there's a niche market maybe you want to adjust. It could be that there's vines adapted to your climate, which I think is very important. How I got started with this is before my days in the wine industry, I taught plant materials at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. And it was really clear that all the really cool plants that grow well in California come from the Mediterranean. And we try growing Northern European plants from England and France, for instance. They struggle a little bit. You know, they really need to have a lot more irrigation. They're more prone to disease. There's issues with them. So if we use Mediterranean plant material, it sort of makes sense that they'll grow well in our climate. So all the things that grow with ease, like rock roses and Mediterranean date palms and oleanders, these things are all med plants that just really right at home here in California. There may be also wine styles that you want to emulate that you particularly like. If you like doing port-style wine, why make it out of Cabernet Sauvignon? Why not make it out of port grapes? And I think also if you're directly selling your wine, if you're a small winery where people are coming to your tasting room, this is a real opportunity to offer something different that maybe your other competitors aren't doing. Okay, so here's some realities. First of all, as wine drinkers are much more adventurous than wine distributors. Wine distributors really have a hard time with something that's new and different. A lot of wine writers don't understand lesser-known varieties, so either ignore them or they wonder why they don't taste like Cabernet from Napa. And this is based on an actual quote. So this is a problem because you don't get a lot of support if you're doing a really outstanding fresa, for instance, and somebody from the Wine Spectator's tasting your wine. They don't have a clue what it is that they're really drinking in most cases. It's hard to sell wines with names that consumers can't pronounce, like Viognier, Montepulciano, Chile Jolo, on and on. So, and you think about it, if you're going out on a date with a woman and you're looking at the wine list and you want to look totally suave and debonair and you can't pronounce the name of the wine, you're not going to order that. You're going to get something from Mondavi and play it safe. And finally, this is another quote, too many SKUs make wine sales staff's head hurt. So they're kind of limited what they want to do. 5 international varieties is great. You really limit what's available. When you start getting up to 15 or 20, then it becomes very, very difficult for a lot of wholesalers to manage this inventory and stock and then send salesmen out there and actually compete and have to hand sell things. And I understand that. It is difficult. It's not just me being sarcastic. Anyway, when I started about 1991 as the viticulture advisor in Mendocino counties, John Vixenstein, who's a regular here at a lot of UNX classes, said you should really work a little bit on your specialty should be something different and work on Mediterranean varieties. And I thought that was a great idea. So starting in 1994, I planted our first one at Hopland Research and Extension Center with 19 cultivars in it. And I inherited, when I took a cross-county assignment in Lake County, the two trials at Romaguer Red Hills, which is an upland area of Lake County, and also the Highland Springs trial, which is around Clear Lake. And I also have done some clonal work with Syrah, which I'm not going to talk about, and now I've just planted a new one in 2006 with 14 new cultivars. So I've really kind of specialized in this area within UC. I have one of the most active programs along with Jim Wolpert, who's been working down at the Kearney Ag Center, which is also very, very warm. So most of these trials would be considered high region 3. This is mid region 3, Winkler region 3, and this is probably a higher Winkler region 2, low Winkler region 3. So we're working in warmer sites. Just by comparison, here's a look at what we're seeing is that Châteauneuf-du-Pape, France is around 2,800 hours, above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The UC Hopland Research and Extension Center is around 3,200. Red Hills is 3,600, which actually puts it almost a low region 4. And then Highland Springs is about 3,000 or low region 3. So I'm going to just give you a quick summary of what we found out in the varieties that we looked at. That's Pinot Gris, Viognier, and Arnais. In the green colors, these are things that ripen pretty easily under our climatic conditions. And as we get to orange and red, it takes longer and longer. So the white wines that we worked with, we found that Marsanne and Cortese were kind of tough. They're getting pretty late, and some years you're going to struggle to ripen them. And it actually would take a warmer climate, which shows that even though we think of Ukiah and Lake County as being warm, for a lot of the med varieties, it's not quite warm enough. We really should be in some place that's got more heat. And when we look at the red varieties, kind of our ripening, Lemberger in the Lake County trial was supposed to be Cortese, but it was misidentified. And when we discovered that it was a red grape and not a white one, it's very interesting what happened. Anna Schneider, who's an apelographer, took a piece home to Italy and grafted it on a vine over there and looked through her books and finally figured out what we had was Lemberger, or Blaufränkisch is another name for it. It's quite early. Along with Pinotage were for the first two things to ripen. And then we can start to see we're getting later and later. The things that are orange, though, basically are ripening okay. And Tempranillo, early to mid-October, its phenology is pretty similar to Zinfandel. And it does fine in our region, so it's a good choice. And Grenache as well is pretty much the same, just a little bit later than Tempranillo. Then we start getting, the stuff in the red means you're going to have a tough time a lot of seasons ripening these things. And when we start getting into early November, it's really, the gig is up where we live because it's starting to rain, and not just a little bit, a lot. So you really need to have a warmer climate. And in fact, if I were going to look at most of these varieties, we'd have to look for the warmest sites in Mendocino and Lake County to grow them. This is probably better suited for Lodi Woodbridge and places in California that have more heat than we do, or the lower elevation parts of the foothills. So this is an example of varieties that probably would be well suited for places with temperature summations above 3,500 hours. The thing that's really funny about the Mediterranean varieties is just the opposite of what I thought I would find, is that the later the variety it is, the later bud break is and the later it ripens. And I'm just curious if the winemakers from years ago deliberately selected for those kind of varieties, thinking that, if they ripen late, that's good because we're less likely to have microbial spoilage. We're going to be making wine at a time where it's cooling down, and our ability to make wine without having other things grow in them, I'm just wondering out loud if maybe that's why they selected the way they did. And interestingly, things that are from more northern climates tend to break bud and ripen early because there's less heat. So the strategy there has always been look for the warm spot in the cold place, and it really sort of plays out in the phenology of a lot of these varieties. The more northern stuff actually breaks bud sooner than things that come out of the southern vineyards of Europe. So these are things that we can find in Mendocino and Lake Counties, actually planted as commercial varieties. Most of it not in very big acreages. Carrion, Grenache, Tempranillo, Mourvedre, and Albarino. Some of them have been here recently, some of them have been here a long time. Carrion, or Carrion as it's known locally, late bud break and ripening, potentially very large yields. Good color and acidity when it's moderately cropped, and totally out of fashion and disappearing fast is the best way to describe it. It's interesting. Historically, Mendocino planted Carrion. In the olden days, everybody was paid pretty much the same in the North Coast for their fruit, and the end of wine growing was northern Healdsburg. No one thought you could grow grapes below that. So the Dry Creek area was really the first significant acreage that you saw, and that was planted a lot to Zinn. And we got up to Hopland area. It's warmer. It's inland, and there's not a lot of fog there, so they could actually plant Carrion and ripen the crop because they could get an extra ton. So they were making more money with it, and that's why it really was Mendocino's most popular variety for a long, long time. Here's a look at the acreage. So we go back to 1960, we had about 1,624 acres, and it actually went up as high as 2,400. That was kind of its peak in 1970. It used to go into a Gallo product known as Hardy Burgundy, and Gallo was our biggest buyer of Carrion for years. And you can see it's just dropping off. So by 2008, there's 409 acres left. So it's about to disappear. This is the kind of place where it's grown in places like Calpella and the Talmadge Bench, in neighborhoods where everyone's name ends in a vowel. A lot of Italian Americans growing these small pieces of land with head pruned vines. Calpella itself is an interesting place. It reminds me of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, except that there's like house trailers and things around, which they don't have in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Here's the vines. They're pretty big, they're pretty vigorous vines, and I was thinking yesterday, Doug Googler and I were actually together yesterday, and we were looking at a Sauvignon Blanc vineyard, and that's just riddled with fungus, wood rotting organisms, and it was about 30 years old. And I'm thinking about a lot of these old Mediterranean varieties have amazing resistance to a lot of diseases. And we won't find 40 or 50-year-old Cabernet vineyards, I guarantee you, even though they're well cared for and people are being really careful. Nobody cared anything about these old guys. They cut them any time of the year. In fact, they used to love to finish up harvest and, pick a 16% sugar, and this is like 1950s and 60s, hurry up and prune them and then go elk hunting up in Montana. So, they would prune really, really early, like around Halloween, and they still didn't have problems with a lot of the wood rotting organisms. That's how tough they are. So we see a lot of really old Mediterranean varieties that have a lot of natural health. These are peasant vines. These are not these aristocrats from northern France. A lot of double pruning for frost protection because the Italian immigrants chose these benches above the Russian River where the cold air didn't settle, and they were more likely not to freeze. But just as kind of an insurance policy, they would always double prune. So they'd leave long canes and then come back in when these buds were popping, cut back over here and try to get the buds to break. And they'd gain another 7 to 10 days of frost-free growing, which is the difference between life and death some years. So that's Carrion. Then moving on to Grenache. Grenache is another variety that was actually planted. The rosé that you got is from vines that were planted in 1917 and head pruned. And Grenache has been around California for a long time. It's a funny variety. There's early bud break and then sort of mid-season ripening. It's very potentially heavily yielding, and the newer clones that we're bringing in, the Grenache Noir and now the Garnacha Tinta, are much improved over old California clones that we had, but nonetheless, these things, when the crop is moderated, can be quite good. And as I said, our oldest vineyard is 1917. Mendocino has the oldest continuous planting of Syrah and probably Grenache in this one vineyard that's planted in Hopland. The acreage overall is pretty small, but it is increasing. Here's kind of a look at what's happened in the last 40 years or so. So very small acreage in 1960, and went up a little bit in 1970 and then fell off by 1990, and now it's back up again. And this is about, around this time is when we started to get some improved clones, and people are taking another look at Grenache. My own opinion is Grenache as a standalone wine may not be the best thing, but it's certainly a wonderful blender. It is a little bit prone to loss of color, but typically the way Californians drink wine, we're normally consuming most of our wines within the first 3 years of its life. And in that 3-year time frame, that's usually okay. The problem with Grenache is when you start getting to year 4 and 5 is when it starts to brown up a little bit and lose some of its pigmentation. As a rosé, it has wonderful aromatics, and in fact, you're not tasting Grenache Noir here, you're tasting Grenache Gris. This actually is a very, very old planting of Grenache Gris because it never was highly pigmented red wine from this particular vineyard. Here's some data actually of what Grenache looks like when we try to grow it, and site becomes everything when it comes to trying to get reasonable balance on it. I want to recognize too Steve Tillicky, who's sitting in the front row. He was working for me at the time that we harvested the Red Hills and Highland Springs vineyards in Lake County, and we didn't do any thinning whatsoever in those vineyards. It was just we let nature take its course. Whereas in Hopland, we were actually doing more typical commercial practices of thinning to 2 clusters per shoot. And you can see pretty productive. I mean, especially in Highland Springs at 8.6 kilograms, there's no way in the world we could really get that particularly ripe. And the number of clusters per meter you can see here at Red Hills, which is a shallower soils and more upland site, not big numbers, but the average cluster weights are still there. Whereas in Hopland, we were thinning quite a bit, and our clusters are a little bit bigger than Red Hills. And when we grow it on the Highland Spring site, which was this sort of alluvial clay soils, everything just was too blown up. Just really not a great red wine site. So that would not be a good choice. I mean, that really should have been vineyard planted all the whites. On the wine grape chemistry, in Red Hills we could ripen it pretty easily, and we could also do the same thing in Hopland and Highland Springs. We never really quite got enough heat, especially with that kind of a crop load, to ripen it. So I think the key here on the North Coast is if you're going to be growing high quality Grenache, you're going to be doing thinning, and you're going to try to choose a site that's warm if you really want to get it right. If you're looking to grow rosés, you probably would want to do then it's not quite so important. But nonetheless, Grenache belongs on red grape ground. Mourvedre or Maturo also is another one that's been around a lot, but in the olden days it was always thrown in for field blending, so it wasn't too uncommon to walk into a Zinfandel vineyard in Mendocino County and other places and have a few Maturos out there. And the old Italians' theory was that you put that in for color, and you also had some white grapes in there for sugar, and then you had Zinfandel to make up the rest, and everything got thrown in together and crushed, and that's the way it was done. And you came out with a product that on the average was drinkable as long as it didn't turn to vinegar on you, which was a real problem when you made everything in redwood tanks and really had no idea what sanitation was. So the good old days for wine drinking in Northern California probably weren't really all that good most years. But anyway, that's what they did. So what we find in Mourvedre is a very late variety, a very late bud break for us in Northern California, and is quite susceptible to winter injury. So we had a real hard time getting this to go in Lake County. In fact, we kind of gave up on our trials because they were budded, and then we had a cold snap, and it killed off most of the vines. The acreage is increasing because there's interest in it. Mourvedre has an amazing ability to improve the quality of particularly Grenache when blended together, and I think that's part of the reason it's used in Chateauneuf du Pape is that it has good acidity and good phenolic content. So when blended with Grenache, it stabilizes color and makes a much longer lasting wine. Here's our acreage. You can see we actually fell off the radar screen there for a while. And that looks big, that's only 10 acres, and even that fell off the radar screen because in 1990 you really couldn't get very good wood. Most of the wood was just being passed around over the fence, and most of it had virus. So you take a late variety and plant it in Mendocino where it's borderline to begin with, and then you have virus in it, and you're never going to get it fully ripe. So now we're coming back and planting some new vineyards, but I don't think Mourvedre is a rising star for our region. I just, there's going to be a few people who plant it who are really interested in Rhone programs, but I don't see it becoming a big factor. On the other hand, Mourvedre, say, grown in Dunnigan Hills would probably be pretty decent. In fact, I know it would because I've tasted it. It's not bad. So places with a little bit more heat and Mourvedre would be good. Interestingly enough, it once was widely planted around what's the Ontario Airport in Southern California, and that was one of the leading places for Mourvedre if you go back 50, 60 years ago. Riverside County is pretty much houses now, so all those old vineyards are disappearing. Here's a little look at it. You can see it's all blank because we planted 60 vines at both locations and they all died from freezing. So that tells me right there, don't put this in a place that's really, really cold. In Hopland, we found that it was not it's kind of a shy bearer. It was a little bit hard to get this to really put a big crop on because the cluster is not big and it just doesn't make a lot of fruit. It is probably the best vine I've ever seen for a vertical shoot position trellis system. You don't have to manipulate the shoots. It goes right up straight between the wires. It's quite incredible. So if you're a VSP lover, this is the vine for you because there's practically no labor in growing this thing. And we see our average cluster weight around 146 grams, which is around a quarter of a pound or so, a little bit over that. So small clusters, really deep color, good phenolics. And we averaged actually through our trial from 2000 to 2004, we got it pretty right. We got it right around 23.7, which for this variety in that location makes very acceptable wine. If you like higher alcohol wines, then you probably need more heat, which means, again, getting closer into the Central Valley. Tempranillo, I think, is potentially really a rising star for California, and this is one we need to take a good, hard look at. It's a mid-season bud break and ripening, very much like Zinfandel. It kind of follows Zinfandel in terms of its phenology. Medium-sized clusters, great color and acidity, and I think very, very promising. This is one we can take a look at. I also think that we need to follow Daryl Cordy's suggestion that if you're going to grow Tempranillo as a new variety in California, don't start out charging huge amounts of money when you can get the Spanish version for half the price. And that kind of killed Sangiovese. Sangiovese eventually is going to recover. My family grows both these varieties, and I know that one of my friends refers to Sangiovese as being sales-proof, and that's kind of an issue because it's really, we've watched the variety go up and go down in terms of acreage, and the people who are left surviving will eventually make it good, but let's try not to do that with these other new promising varieties like Tempranillo. Here's some information on this. We found that we're getting about 2.8 kilograms per meter of cordon, which puts it in kind of moderate production with 36 clusters, and about, again, 150 grams per cluster, which makes it a nice size but not huge. Average berry weight, 1.78 grams. pH is a little bit high. That's one of the things that we found in Hopland was that the pH on the average was a little bit higher than we thought it would be. But we also got a pretty good rye at 24.9, and this is picking probably about mid-October. So it seems to fit well into sort of the warm area of Northern California. I think this is one that we can grow fairly easily. Just want to talk a little bit about the Portuguese varieties. We don't have a lot of experience with it. There's a little bit of planting of Susal and Touriga Nacional. Susal is quite vigorous. Not highly productive. You don't get huge amounts of fruit off of this, but it's got red juice, and which is one of the reasons that initially it was planted as kind of a tintor. The biggest planting we had was Parducci Cellars. John Parducci had this idea, if you take and blend this with inland grown Pinot Noir, you end up with a pretty good wine. And oddly enough, in the Mendocino wine competition one year, this won the best of show for Pinot Noir, which was just shocked everybody from Anderson Valley, because Anderson Valley is supposed to be the exclusive place to grow Pinot in Mendocino County. But that was John's idea, and that was one that worked. Touriga Nacional makes fabulous still wine. Again, both these varieties are pretty late, so it's not going to be for every location. But again, if I were growing red fruit in Lodi Woodbridge and I wanted to grow good quality red wine, I'd probably be looking at something like this and not at Merlot. And certainly not at Pinot Noir, even though Pinot has actually been planted in the Lodi Woodbridge area because someone had a contract, it's an international variety. We'll make it work. And this, on the other hand, would make probably pretty distinctive wine. This is not a high yielder. Let's see, in this case I have tons per acre as well as yield per vine. So you can see we're averaging about 4 tons in Hopland with this and about 5.5 with the Suzal. Touriga's got slightly smaller clusters and lower yields. But again, very, very interesting variety. And then when you actually make port wine out of these, it tastes a lot like port wine from Portugal. There's a real strong varietal characteristic in California that even will tide you over with these varieties. I'm moving on now for our second trial with this, and this is my swan song trial because it takes about 10 years to get through this. I planted this in 2006, so I'll be retiring out about 2016, so this is sort of the end of the line for me. But this is the things that I'm looking at that I think have potential interest from Spain. Albarino and Periquita. Nobody mentioned Periquita from Portugal today, and I guess maybe they think it's just not a particularly exciting variety, but I've had a lot of nice Periquita wines when I was in Portugal, and it's, not every wine's got to be a blockbuster. It's one of the things that we can't get across sometimes, but there's also this thing that we call locally chateau cash flow, where you make things that are drinkable like instantly, and Periquita kind of fits that ticket. It makes these, like Fresa from northern Italy, it makes these wines that are very nice and drinkable and fun. And then I'm taking another look at some of the port varieties, Tinta Amarella and Tinta Francesa, and I want to get more information on Touriga Nacional. The first go at it with Touriga Nacional and Suzal was just based on about 5 vines, and now we've got 40 planted, so we're going to get better information. The hope for my Hopland trials is that we have a printed reference for you. If you're interested in these varieties, you want to know, what are they like? It's really hard to know because we don't have a lot of things in English written. I was really fascinated today by both George's talk and also from Jesus about all these varieties that I have no idea really what they grow like, and to actually have something in the English language that's written and to get some sense of yield. I think that's why these trials are important. So I went through these already. Also, I didn't mention Graziano. Graziano, I think, is potentially an interesting variety as a standalone. It's also quite aromatic, at least the ones that I've tasted pure, with a little bit of ones that have been grown as a single variety, although it is used primarily for blending, for kind of beefing up Tempranillo some. And it's late, so again, it may not be the best thing for us, but we're going to give it a try.
You have plenty of time for questions. One right there.
That's a good question, is that a lot of the Mediterranean varieties are quite vigorous, and how do I feel about it and managing it? I'm starting to agree with Andy Walker, who says that irrigation is not sustainable. And that sounds really, how do you say, insightful, but as in inciting a riot, not thoughtful. But this spring we had this near situation of having our water shut off by Fish and Game and the National Marine Fisheries Service for frost protection. So, we're having to think about irrigation a lot, and we grow grapes in places that 50 years ago wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have water frost protection. So I think we need to design vineyards that can take some drought, and these guys definitely can take some drought. And in fact, all the old Carrion and Zinfandel and Petit Syrah, they were never irrigated until probably about the 1970s or 80s. They were pretty much dryland grown. When we start to irrigate them and put them on trellises, then we have to really think about how do you devigorate, and we're doing it in part with rootstock. I'm not convinced necessarily that VSPs are the best way for us to grow things. We probably need to do kind of a modified California sprawl where we make more of a parasol to protect the fruit from sunburn, because sunburn is always a problem. And I think we need to space our vines a little bit further apart and sort of plan for a bigger vine. Again, don't use the Bordeaux Burgundian model of a bunch of little plants squeezed together, because it probably isn't the right thing for us.
Other questions? Okay, if not, I think we should thank Glenn very much for a good presentation.